Whether we're talking about religion or ideologies, it is best to stop hoping for things to be true in the absence of evidence. It is best to stop hoping for things to be true in the presence of opposing evidence. That is the ideal. But in my adult years, it became increasingly clear that, with the exception of my loved ones and my therapist, I wasn't going to be valued by the world unless I kept myself intrinsically passionate. What happens when some people view themselves as merely dancing bags of protein and electrical impulses and organic molecules that simply spill into oblivion after a few decades, though? Even now, often I talk to my girlfriend about wanting to stay home and be a house boyfriend or house husband in the future or whatever. She wouldn't mind that, but again, should I just have faith that someone like me can go out there and get a job and that'll make me happy? I mean, I'd rather be at home with someone I love, but that can stunt a person's sociability. Thing is, I haven't had a full-time permanent job in over 3 years. No staffing agency has helped me. No contacts have come. No volunteer work has been fruitful. No temp job has taken me as a hire. And the dozens of interviews I've had, well, you can tell, nothing's come of that. So I just put on a suit, and despite my disdain toward faith, faith is exactly what I end up having. I'm not seeing any evidence that I'll get a position, or that all the hard work that I've had up to this point was worth it. In other words, what do you do when the environment that you perceive seems to give you pretty consistent evidence that you're not going to be happy? Well, you get depressed trying to have faith, holding on to ideas that don't work. And so now, I intend to stop doing that. And who knows? Maybe that can build up. More importantly, though, I choose to take as many moments as I can meditating. Meditating helps to clear one's mind of the values imposed upon one's environment, leaving only the environment, the physiological state, the psychological state. It helps you to realize that what's around you, what you perceive, and what you are, all three of those things are just the inanimate and animate manifestations of the universe. My body's molecules, the neural pathways, the elements of the universe itself, they're all just natural consequences of the building blocks of reality, interacting with each other, amazingly, unbelievably. There's no reason for the pleasure-seeking, the people-pleasing, the apologizing, the regretting, the fearing, the raging. It's all just the world, your body, and your mind colluding and colliding when one realizes that all of us are just bundles of molecules, just like the world around us. It's this sort of thing that makes me stop short of calling all faith inherently bad. Because in truth, it's not really bad or good. It's just the step that we take before we're wise enough to imbue meaning into the world in a way that shows that our meanings are just as important as anyone else's. I mean, faith is the defense mechanism. It's the Band-Aid before the treatment. It's the training wheels of existentialism before you go riding up by yourself. Faith is what makes tribes fear each other or praise each other until they actually learn about each other. It's what makes countries think that they should last forever and they are so wonderful, or that they should change their entire political systems violently. It can be what makes us anxious, depressed, antisocial, delusional, dangerously neurotic, but it can also make us tremendously hopeful. But it isn't the way to live. It's just how many people live now. And I think that we'll all be a little bit less miserable if we push through that faith a little bit at a time so we can reach the other side. Here's what I value. Here's how I see things. So when a person considers one group's interest to be more valuable than another's, that person's committing a fallacy because it begs the question of how that value was determined. Inherently, there's an infinite regress that exists when all value is at least partially dependent on the subjective perspective of somebody else, whether it's through favoritism or authority or conventional generalizations. I'll give you an example. So, if I'm interested in buying a new phone, I would value the kind of phone that helps me do my most frequent tasks. If I use it to get to work on time, my employer will value my work ethic. If the employer capitalizes on my work and prospers, the investors of that business will value the progress. And if the investors live comfortably on their returns, the doctors, childcare workers, lawyers, and all the others will value the investor's health and stability. All of these aspects of life are valued within the intricate web of interests that extends all over the world. Basically, there doesn't seem to be an objective, independent origin of the value of one's life. There's no metric, no meter stick that one uses to measure one's meaning. There's no one group or individual that has more value than another, because that value is dependent on whatever agreements the people had that are involved. Humans perceive their own value when others imbue that value into them in the most rational way possible. And even if, hypothetically, there was some ultimate being or entity that valued some people over others, there's no evidence to support that being's existence or its intentions. No one group seems to be externally favored over another in any historical sense. Human beings thrive on the circumstances and ingenuity of the people around them, not some act of providence. So one cannot rationally act in opposition to someone else's interests unless they directly negate one's own interests. The most rational thing to do would be to act as if the interests of all people are equally valid, and to prevent anyone from acting in a way that robs agency from other people. This wouldn't guarantee necessarily that every individual will attain an optimal lifespan or a perfect lifestyle. It's merely an acknowledgement of the burden that anyone can cause when others suffer from involuntarily yielding resources and services just to make that person's interests happen. And this burden is irrational because no one's self-interests are demonstrably more valuable than those of any others. As long as people are willing to yield resources and services for the mutual benefit or the shared interests of people around them, the experiences of life, no matter how challenging, can continue to be valuable from the perspectives of all involved. So when a person is depressed, one's self-interests are blunted by the perception that one is burdening someone else in the environment. In a sense, this can be a rational reaction, even if that rationality is limited. Toward the end of one's life, if biological resources become increasingly limited and the physiological functions deteriorate, one's self-interests would require far too much care and support to maintain, and gradually achieving all those interests becomes too dangerous or painful to achieve. When the ailments exceed medical means, costs, or human ability, the burden of biological maintenance and the lack of mobility leads to that diminishing of self-interest, which often leads to a reluctant, yet resigned, acceptance of the inevitable end of life. At that time, the person would have realized every conceivable interest that served the mutual benefit of everyone in the environment. It was their time, in other words. However, there are those depressed individuals who are surrounded by those who are perceived to be already wholly burdened by them, whether this is true or not. And those people, well, Not to be condescending, but they're too young to feel that way. These depressed people aren't privy to the neurochemical, nutritional, or social advancements that can support them until they get into the presence of nurturing people. And those nurturers can show those depressed people that the dulled interest need no longer be considered a burden to the people around them, because they're at least valued by one person. Psychological therapy helps to demonstrate that life ostensibly is always valuable if one's interests are shown to benefit or match those of someone else. The argument I'm presenting here is insinuating three ways to exist. Either you can believe that your interests are more valuable than other people's, you could believe that your interests are less valuable than other people's, or you can believe that all people's interests are equally valuable. Those who don't believe that all our interests have equal value may exhibit self-gratifying or self-destructive behavior. If they're challenged to find common interests or mutual benefits, eventually they'll realize that there is no inherent intrinsic value that appraises one person's desires over another. Their belief in this apparent imbalance of value amongst people would, by definition, reveal that they still consider some interests to be more valuable than others. They would benefit from being aware of this fact, and they'll carefully determine the origins of all those values that they placed on their own interests, whether it's the expectations, the goals, the material possessions, all of those. And when you question those, it leads to that cognitive shift in behavior and mood that is so necessary in an environment where people struggle to remain rigid and predictable, to try to figure out what matters most. It's conducive to one's well-being to step away from the norms and conventions of the world, understanding that one is no more or less valuable at the beginning of life than one is at the end of life. What matters in between is who valued you while you were still alive. That's my perspective for the time being. That's why I left faith behind. And I'm not going back. Thanks for listening.